At that moment, Muhammad Ali could have kept doing exactly what America allowed him to do. Fight, win, entertain, smile for cameras, and leave the deeper questions untouched. The country loved him that way. Loud, fast, spectacular, and silent about everything that actually hurt. But the day he spoke about race, dignity, and who this country was really built for, he crossed a line no championship belt could protect him from. Before that, Ali was celebrated as a miracle that didn't demand reflection. A black man allowed to be extraordinary as long as his greatness stayed contained inside the ring. His confidence was tolerated because it could be packaged as showmanship. His bravado was forgiven because it sold tickets. As long as he kept punching instead of pointing, the system was comfortable. That comfort mattered more than admiration. Outside the arenas, the world he lived in was sharply divided. Restaurants he couldn't enter, neighborhoods he was warned away from, respect that disappeared the moment the gloves came off. America applauded his victories, then quietly returned to treating him like he knew his place. Ali saw that contradiction clearly. He noticed how praise came with conditions. Be grateful. Be entertaining. Don't challenge the story people wanted to tell about themselves. They were fine watching a black man dominate another man in public, but deeply uneasy hearing him speak about equality in plain language. That unease followed him everywhere. Journalists laughed when he joked but stiffened when he turned serious. Sponsors loved his image, not his opinions. Even supporters urged caution, framing silence as strategy, as if dignity needed better timing. Ali felt the pressure early, not as threats, but as guidance, gentle reminders of what was acceptable. He was encouraged to focus on sports, to leave race and segregation to more qualified voices. His role, they implied, was inspiration, not confrontation, and for a while he understood the temptation. It would have been easy to stay beloved, to keep the noise loud enough that no one heard the questions underneath, to accept admiration instead of demanding respect. That path was wide and well lit, but Ali wasn't confused about what he was seeing. He understood that silence wasn't neutral. It was permission, permission for the same signs, the same doors, the same limits to remain unquestioned. Every smile that avoided the truth helped preserve a system built on separation. The moment he recognized that, the fight changed. It was no longer about winning. It was about whether he was willing to use the one thing the world couldn't ignore, his voice, knowing exactly what it would cost him. If you've ever been celebrated for your talent but discouraged from telling the truth, stay with this story. He had seen how carefully the boundaries were drawn, how success was allowed, but only within limits that kept power untouched. Crossing those limits meant becoming something else in the public eye. Not a hero, but a problem. Ali understood that choosing to speak would not elevate him. It would isolate him, and isolation was the real punishment. Still, the alternative felt worse, living inside approval that required him to shrink, accepting applause that came with conditions he could no longer ignore. He knew that once he spoke plainly, there would be no way to return to being harmless. And that knowledge settled heavily, but clearly. This was the beginning of a different kind of fight, one that would not end with a bell, and not everyone would survive watching it. The shift didn't happen all at once. There was no single speech that changed everything, no moment where the room froze and the rules collapsed. It happened gradually, in the way people started listening differently, in the way laughter faded when Ali stopped performing and started meaning what he said. He felt it first in interviews. Questions changed shape. They were no longer about speed or confidence. They circled his words instead, his tone, his intentions. Journalists asked him to clarify, then re-clarify, as if repetition might soften the message, as if careful phrasing could turn conviction into controversy and controversy into something dismissible. Ali noticed how quickly sincerity became discomfort. When he spoke about segregation, about dignity, about the daily humiliations Black Americans were expected to absorb quietly, The room tightened, not with anger, but with unease, the kind that comes when a subject threatens the comfort of people who prefer injustice to be abstract. He understood then that his voice reached places his fists never could. Words lingered. They traveled. They couldn't be edited out with highlights or drowned out by applause. Once spoken, they forced a reaction, agreement, rejection, fear. Silence was no longer an option for anyone listening. That realization carried weight. Ali began to see how carefully the public conversation was managed, which voices were welcomed, which were tolerated, which were warned. He had been allowed to be loud as long as his noise stayed entertaining. But clarity was different. Clarity disrupted balance. Supporters grew cautious. They didn't argue with his points. They worried about timing, about consequences, about whether he was risking too much for ideas that could wait. Their concern was framed as care, but it still asked the same thing. Lower your voice. Ali recognized that request for what it was, an attempt to keep the hierarchy intact without admitting it existed. He also saw how his words reached people who were never meant to hear them. Young black men repeating his statements, communities quoting him without irony. His voice had slipped beyond control, and that frightened the system more than defiance ever could. Because fists end fights, ideas start them. Ali felt the responsibility settle in. Not pride, not certainty, responsibility. He couldn't unsee what his words were doing. He couldn't pretend they were harmless anymore. Each sentence carried weight he hadn't planned for, and that made silence feel like withdrawal. This wasn't about being right. It was about being present. He knew the cost would come later. He could feel it gathering, the subtle distancing, the recalibration of how he was described, admiration thinning into caution, love into tolerance. But he also knew something else. Once your voice finds its purpose, you don't get to choose ignorance again. If you've ever realized that speaking clearly changes how the world treats you, stay with this story. Ali understood that influence isn't given, it's discovered. And once discovered, it demands a response. He could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet. The applause no longer meant safety, and silence no longer felt neutral. This was the beginning of awareness, awareness that could not be undone and would not be forgiven easily. The voice had escaped the ring, and there was no bringing it back. That freedom came with a price he was only beginning to understand. But it already felt unavoidable and strangely necessary. The reaction didn't arrive as outrage. It arrived as distance. Invitations slowed. Praise became cautious. The warmth that once followed Ali into rooms cooled into something more controlled. He wasn't attacked head-on. He was adjusted around. This was how resistance was handled when it couldn't be denied. Media coverage shifted tone. Not openly hostile, just careful. His words were framed as provocative instead of honest. Context was trimmed. Questions focused less on what he said and more on whether he should have said it at all. The message was subtle but consistent. This was becoming uncomfortable. Ali watched how quickly admiration learned new rules. He noticed which statements were quoted and which were ignored, which parts of his voice were amplified and which were quietly set aside. He wasn't misrepresented so much as narrowed, reduced to something easier to digest. The system didn't need to silence him. It only needed to reshape him. He felt that reshaping in conversations with people who once celebrated him. They spoke about responsibility, about influence, about consequences that extended beyond intention. Their concerns sounded reasonable. That was the danger. Reason was being used as a leash. Ali understood that the antagonist wasn't anger. It was expectation. An expectation that he would eventually soften, that he would learn where the invisible boundaries were and respect them, that he would return to being a symbol instead of a voice. But Ali had already crossed that threshold. He saw how clearly race shaped who was allowed to speak without penalty. White athletes who commented were praised as thoughtful. Black athletes were warned about distractions. The difference wasn't subtle. It was structural. That realization stripped away any remaining illusion of fairness. He also saw how the conversation tried to reframe him, not as someone addressing injustice, but as someone creating division. The burden shifted quietly. The problem was no longer segregation. It was his willingness to name it. Ali felt the weight of that inversion. It made speaking harder and more necessary. Because silence now wouldn't just preserve comfort. It would confirm the narrative forming around him, that he had gone too far, that he had misunderstood his place. He knew then that the pressure wasn't meant to stop him immediately. It was meant to exhaust him, to make every word feel heavier than the last. This was the antagonist's truth. Stability mattered more than justice. Calm mattered more than honesty. And anyone who disrupted that balance would be treated as the disruption itself. Ali could feel that logic pressing in from all sides, but he also understood something else. Once you see how a system protects itself, you can't pretend your voice doesn't matter. If you've ever felt the room grow colder when you spoke plainly, stay with this story. The discomfort around him wasn't accidental. It was instructional, a lesson in what happens when you refuse to stay useful. Ali recognized the lesson, but he didn't absorb it. He let it sit where it belonged, outside himself. The choice ahead was becoming clearer. Either retreat into comfort or continue forward into isolation, knowing exactly why it was happening. There was no neutral ground left, and pretending there was would only serve the lie. Ali understood that clearly now. The distance around him confirmed it, and the silence ahead promised more of the same. He stayed with the truth anyway. That was the line he would not cross. Pressure intensified without announcing itself. It didn't arrive as a warning or a threat. It came as repetition, as the same conversations, the same doubts, the same suggestions delivered with increasing patience. Ali felt how the space around him narrowed, not because doors slammed shut, but because fewer doors were offered at all. Public conversations about him grew careful. His name was now followed by qualifiers. Talented but controversial. Brilliant but distracting. His voice was no longer treated as insight, but as risk. People spoke as if protecting him, while quietly protecting themselves. That was the mechanism at work. Ali saw how institutions responded when a challenge refused to fade. They didn't confront it directly. They waited. They delayed. They allowed time to do the heavy lifting. Pressure, when applied slowly enough, feels like reason. He was advised to recalibrate, to choose moments more wisely, to consider the broader picture. These weren't commands. They were invitations to self-censor, to participate in his own containment. Ali recognized the pattern. The message was consistent. You can keep your platform as long as you soften your message. You can stay visible as long as you stay manageable. The offer was never framed as compromise. It was framed as responsibility. But responsibility to whom? Ali felt the answer clearly. Responsibility to comfort, to order, to a version of peace that required silence from those most affected by injustice. He noticed how the pressure reached inward. Doubt surfaced more often, not about whether he was right, but about how much longer he could hold this line. Fatigue crept in, not physical exhaustion, but the weariness of constant justification. This was escalation without spectacle. The cost was no longer hypothetical. It lived in strained relationships, in conversations that stopped mid-sentence, in the subtle shift of how people positioned themselves around him. He was no longer simply present. He was something to be managed. Ali understood that this stage was designed to feel personal, to make the consequences feel self-inflicted, to suggest that isolation was the result of stubbornness, not structure, that if he adjusted even slightly, the pressure would ease. And that was true. But ease came with erasure. Ali stood inside that tension, fully aware of what was being asked of him. To speak less clearly, to choose words that blurred meaning, to trade truth for access. He felt how tempting that trade could be. This was the moment pressure became intimate, when the world stopped pushing from the outside and started negotiating from within. If you've ever felt yourself being worn down instead of confronted, stay with this story. Ali understood that this was how many voices disappeared, not through force, but through fatigue. The system didn't need agreement, it needed quiet, and quiet was being offered as relief. Ali felt that offer hovering in every interaction. He could feel how easy it would be to mistake silence for wisdom, restraint for growth. Many had done exactly that before him. That knowledge didn't comfort him. It sharpened the choice instead. This wasn't about saying everything. It was about refusing to say nothing. Ali felt the pressure reach its peak here. Not loud, not violent, but persistent, designed to outlast conviction. Ali knew what usually came next. Most people gave in here. That was the design, and the expectation. Ali was still standing inside it, watching carefully, unmoved, still. The turning point didn't look like rebellion. It looked like refusal to soften. Ali didn't announce it. He didn't dramatize it. He simply stopped adjusting his language to make others comfortable. The clarity stayed intact, even as the consequences sharpened. This was the line he chose to hold, not because it was heroic, but because stepping back now would mean pretending he hadn't learned what he already knew. The system sensed that shift immediately. Conversations became shorter. Access tightened. The patience that had once felt strategic began to thin. Ali understood that he had entered the most dangerous phase, the one where compromise was still possible, but integrity would not survive it. He saw how quickly options were framed as opportunities. Invitations returned, but with expectations attached. Appear, but don't provoke. Speak, but don't insist. Be present, but not precise. The offers were reasonable. That was the trap. Reason was being used to erase meaning. Ali weighed the cost carefully, not in public terms but in private ones. He thought about how it would feel to explain himself later, to admit that he had known better and still chosen ease. That imagined conversation settled the decision for him. He didn't need to be louder. He needed to be consistent. So he stayed exact with his words. He didn't chase approval or argue with misrepresentation. He let statements stand without cushioning them. That steadiness unsettled people more than anger ever could. Anger could be dismissed. Precision could not. The reaction came quietly. Doors didn't slam. They stopped opening. He wasn't attacked. He was sidelined. The system didn't want a fight. It wanted space. Ali accepted that space. He recognized it as the price of clarity, not isolation for its own sake, but separation from a narrative he could no longer serve. He wasn't being punished for speaking. He was being distanced for refusing to blur. That understanding changed how he carried the moment. The fear he had expected didn't arrive. In its place came resolve. Not confidence, but alignment. He no longer needed reassurance that this choice mattered. The resistance itself confirmed it. This was the point of no return. Not because he couldn't go back, but because going back would now be deliberate. There would be no confusion to hide behind, only intention. Ali chose intention. He allowed the consequences to arrive without chasing them or avoiding them. He stayed present, exact, and unyielding in the one way that mattered. He did not make himself smaller to be allowed back in. If you've ever realized that compromise can erase more than it preserves, stay with this story. The backlash never needed to shout to be effective. By the time Ali reached this stage, the volume had dropped, but the message had sharpened. He was no longer being persuaded. He was being categorized, placed carefully into a space where his words could exist without disturbing the center. This was containment. Opportunities didn't vanish completely. They were filtered. Invitations came with conditions so subtle they could be denied if questioned. Panels instead of platforms. Commentary instead of leadership. He was welcome as long as he didn't set the direction. Ali saw the shape of the compromise clearly. It wasn't about silence anymore. It was about dilution. He noticed how often his statements were reframed after he left the room. How others summarized his position in softer language, as if translating something dangerous into something safe. His voice was present, but his meaning was slowly being edited out. That editing carried intent. Ali understood that the system preferred figures who could be referenced without being followed, symbols without momentum, voices without consequence. He had been allowed to inspire. He was no longer allowed to mobilize. The pressure took on a new form, not isolation, but inclusion without influence. A seat at the table where decisions had already been made, recognition stripped of agency. That was harder to refuse than rejection, because it offered proximity, it offered relevance, it offered the illusion of impact. Ali felt the temptation in that illusion, to accept the role, to become a respected voice that changed nothing, to trade friction for access. Many had done exactly that and called it progress. Ali called it disappearance. He recognized how easily moral clarity could be traded for procedural respect, how often people mistook being invited for being heard. That confusion kept systems intact far longer than opposition ever could. The cost of refusal became clearer now. It wasn't dramatic punishment. It was gradual fading, a slow repositioning away from the center of attention, from urgency, from consequence. Ali accepted that cost deliberately. He chose to remain precise even when precision narrowed his audience. He chose to speak without adapting his meaning to survive the room. That choice didn't make him louder. It made him harder to absorb. And that was the point. Because influence that can be absorbed can also be neutralized. Ali understood that he was no longer fighting for approval or access. He was preserving coherence, the alignment between what he saw and what he said. Losing that alignment would cost more than any opportunity offered to replace it. This was the price of refusing dilution. If you've ever been invited closer only to be made smaller, stay with this story. The world is skilled at rewarding agreement with visibility and punishing clarity with patience. Ali could feel that lesson repeating itself in every interaction. Nothing was taken from him directly. It was simply made easier to look past him. He watched as conversations moved on without him, not because his words lacked truth, but because they carried too much weight to be convenient. That awareness settled into something steady. Not bitterness, not pride, responsibility. He understood that the cost of staying exact would be paid daily in small omissions and quiet exclusions. But those costs no longer felt negotiable. He had moved past the point where comfort could compete with truth. That was the transformation no headline recorded. The world eventually learned how to speak about Ali without listening to him. His name remained useful. His presence did not. Over time, his words were referenced more than they were respected, quoted without consequence, remembered without urgency. That distance used to feel like loss. Now it felt like clarity. Ali understood that change rarely announces itself through approval. It settles quietly in the places no one is looking, in habits, in language, in what people allow themselves to question. His voice no longer needed permission to exist. It had already moved beyond control. He noticed how often people tried to soften his legacy after the fact, to frame his stand as symbolic rather than disruptive, to turn discomfort into inspiration and resistance into nostalgia. It was easier to admire him in retrospect than to confront what he had demanded in real time. Ali let that happen, not because it was accurate, but because it was inevitable. He had learned that systems reinterpret threats once they can no longer silence them. What was once dangerous becomes admirable. What was once urgent becomes historic. That shift didn't erase the truth. It confirmed it. The real outcome of his choice wasn't recognition, it was continuity. He lived inside the same alignment long after attention moved on. The consistency between what he believed and how he spoke remained intact. That integrity became his private measure of success, independent of applause or agreement. There were still costs, still moments of isolation, still reminders of what he had lost by refusing to dilute himself. But those losses no longer felt like punishment. They felt like evidence. Evidence that the line he refused to cross had mattered. Ali came to understand that the world doesn't need to change for a choice to be meaningful. Meaning isn't granted externally. It's sustained internally, in the quiet refusal to betray what you see clearly. This story isn't about Muhammad Ali. It's about what happens after the moment you decide not to be convenient. When the noise fades, when the crowd moves on, when all that remains is whether you can live inside the truth you spoke. The impact of that decision revealed itself slowly, not in victories or public apologies, but in permission. Permission for others to speak without asking first. Permission to name injustice without dressing it up. Permission to refuse gratitude for surviving inequality. Ali saw fragments of that permission reflected back at him, in younger voices that sounded less cautious, in questions that no longer waited for approval, in the absence of fear where fear had once been expected. That was the inheritance he had not planned for. He never claimed credit for it. Influence, he learned, doesn't require ownership. It requires consistency, showing up the same way long enough that others realize they are allowed to do the same. He understood then that history doesn't reward comfort. It records friction, the moments where someone refused to smooth the edge that needed to remain sharp. Ali had lived inside that edge, not perfectly, not without doubt, but without retreat. That was enough. Enough to leave a mark that couldn't be fully erased, only reframed. Enough to remain present even in absence. Enough to prove that silence is not the only form of survival, and that dignity does not require applause. This understanding stayed with him long after the spotlight faded. If you've ever wondered whether a voice can matter even after the room goes silent, stay with this story.